Good afternoon and good morning and good evening to everyone depending on where you are. Welcome to this second section of the World Migratory Bird Day Global Light Pollution webinars. My name is Vivian Fu, Communication Officer of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership Secretariat, and I will be the moderator of today's webinar, together with Mr. Florian Kyle, who will be the moderator for the Q&A sections. World Migratory Bird Day is an annual global awareness raising campaign, highlights the ecological importance of migratory birds, and it is celebrated on every second Saturday in May and October, which is the coming Saturday. The webinars are jointly organized by the Convention on Migratory Species, CMS, the African Eurasian Migratory Waterbirds Agreements, IWA, the Environment for the Americas, and the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership is joining for the first time to organize the World Migratory Bird Day event. This year, the theme of the World Migratory Bird Day is light pollution, with the slogan, "Dim the lights for birds at night." This is the first session yesterday was on show, providing an overview of the issues of light pollution impact to migratory birds. And today, this section will specifically address the solutions and policy needed to tackle the problem. Today, we have 3 speakers from different parts of the world, sharing with us solutions to tackle this impact of light pollution on migratory birds with the perspective from global, national, and city levels. As this is the first joint webinars of the World Migratory Bird Day with the partners, we received messages from the World Migratory Bird Day partners, the CMS, EAFP, IWA, and the Environment for the Americas. So first of all, Ms. Amy Franco, Executive Secretary of the CMS, will give us a welcoming speech in the recorded videos.
It is a great pleasure to be able to say a few opening remarks on behalf of the Convention on Migratory Species for this World Migratory Bird Day webinar on the topic of light pollution. As you will hear during the webinar, light pollution is a significant and growing threat to wildlife, including many migratory birds. Each year, light pollution contributes to the death of millions of birds. It can change their migration patterns, foraging behaviors, and can attract and disorient them, making them more vulnerable to collisions and other dangers. In fact, some experts would say that natural darkness is important for conservation in the same way as clean water, air, and soil. The good news is that solutions to address the impacts of light pollution are readily available. And as you will hear during this webinar, many governments, cities, companies, and communities around the world have already taken steps to address light pollution. On the international level, there has also been work done in this area under the Convention on Migratory Species. In 2020, CMS parties endorsed light pollution guidelines that include 6 simple management principles to reduce light pollution and technical guidance for addressing light pollution impacts on marine turtles, seabirds, and migratory shorebirds. We are now working on new guidelines, which will provide additional measures and further consolidate the guidance on the topic. These will be presented to CMS parties for adoption at the next CMS Conference of the Parties that will take place in 2023. We hope that this webinar and all the activities being conducted in the context of World Migratory Bird Day will help raise awareness of this growing issue and also help to lead to further concrete commitments and pledges from key decision makers around the world to take steps to reduce the impact of light pollution on migratory birds. I want to thank you for your support and engagement in this very important topic by joining this webinar.
Thank you, Ms. Franco. Next, we have video message from Mr. Doug Watkins, Chief Executive of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership Secretariat.
Happy World Migratory Bird Day. I'm Doug Watkins, the Chief Executive of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership Secretariat. Joining with the Convention on Migratory Species, the African Eurasian Migratory Waterbird Agreement, and Environment for the Americas, EAFP is actively supporting the global campaign to raise awareness of migratory birds and their migration. As our Earth continues to become brighter by 2% each year, the artificial light from our cities impacts on the biorhythms of birds. It can disorientate migrating birds and cause them to collide into buildings, which is often fatal for them. With the slogan, "Dim the lights for birds at night," World Migratory Bird Day this year hopes to turn a much needed spotlight on this issue. I hope this joint Global Migratory Bird Day webinar series will bring to you insights into solutions to address light pollution for migratory water birds.
Thank you. Following, we are honored to have Dr. Jakes Truvili, Executive Secretary of the African Eurasian Migratory Birds Agreement, to join us and give the speech in person today.
Thank you, Vivian. It's really a great pleasure to have been invited to say a few quick opening remarks on behalf of AEWA to this webinar on the topic of light pollution. AEWA stands for African Eurasian Migratory Waterbird Agreement, and I'm the Executive Secretary of the Secretariat. We are bringing 83 parties together to work on a collaborative mode. And AEWA is also one of the main partners behind World Migratory Bird Day. In fact, we launched this World Migratory Bird Day in 2006, dealing with avian influenza, which is still an issue to discuss also. And there is a lot of concern. But this year, we are focusing on the topic of light pollution, and more we are seeing that light pollution is being recognized as a threat to migratory bird and other wildlife. And yesterday, during a seminar, we got a lot of information from the USA showing that not only songbirds are attracted by the lights, but also many waterbirds, many shorebirds are either disturbed or attracted by the light from the cities, from the road. And it's really, we are really concerned also by seabirds, which could land on ship or on land and are not able to find their way again to the colonies. Since some months, most of the developed countries in Europe have to decrease their consumption of energy because of the international crisis on the borders of Europe. Saving energy in many countries will imply reducing light, not only along public streets, but also in many buildings. And we have to build also on this opportunity that the crisis represents to explain the impact on light pollution on birds. So in a way to show people that reducing light is not only due to this energy crisis, but also it's good for biodiversity. And we should ensure that we will not come back to kind of business as usual once the crisis is over. We are delighted that the topic of light pollution has received growing attention in the context of World Migratory Bird Days this year. And I hope that this seminar, which I've organized together with our main partners in the America, in Asia, and CMS on the global level, will also contribute to this. And finally, thank you for your interest for this important topic. And I wish you an interesting and enjoyable webinar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for the message. And last but not least, let's welcome Ms. Susan Bonfield, Director of Environment for the Americas, to deliver the speech for us today.
Celebrating the phenomenon of migration and the birds that journey hundreds and thousands of miles between breeding and non-breeding sites around the world. The challenges these birds face, from the smallest of hummingbirds to raptors and seabirds, are enormous. The purpose of World Migratory Bird Day is to bring the latest in scientific research to people around the world, raising awareness of the spectacle of migration, where birds go, how they navigate, and the factors that impact their success. This year, our focus on the importance of dark skies brings attention to the growing threat of light pollution on night migrating birds. At least 80% of migratory birds depend on dark skies as they fly across oceans, cities, and coastlines. But the light that is emitted from homes and buildings, street lights, and even ships detracts and confuses many birds, taking them off course, causing exhaustion, and resulting in other behavioral changes. World Migratory Bird Day serves as a call to action for migratory bird conservation. We invite you to join us now and every day by taking simple steps that, when accomplished individually by many, become the foundation for collective action. So take a moment, dim your lights, share the importance of dark skies with your friends and neighbors, and support dark sky friendly lighting in your community. Together, we can bring back the night.
Thank you very much, Susan. And without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker. I would like to introduce Dr. Marco Babari, Scientific and Technical Officer at CMS. Dr. Babari is the conservation biologist by training. He holds a doctorate in environmental science from the University of Genoa, Italy. After a few years of work as a research assistant, he undertook a career in international organizations. He worked for 8 years for the Mediterranean Action Plan of the UNEP. In the year 2000, he moved to Bonn to join the CMS Secretariat. He held different positions in the Secretariat over the years. Currently, he is the scientific advisor of the Secretariat. One of his main responsibilities and of particular relevant to this webinar is leading on the topic of light pollution, which includes overseeing the guiding the development of the new CMS guidelines on light pollution and to be presented to the next CMS COP in 2023. So over to you, Dr. Babari.
Thank you very much, Vivian, and good day to all those who has joined this webinar today. I'm very grateful to the organizers for having invited me to be part of this of today's program. Let me just say, I mean, a few elements of my presentation has already been say mentioned in the introductory remarks from Amy Frankel that we just heard. I will maybe just go into a bit more of details on the say, initiatives which have been undertaken by CMS in relation to light pollution. Just for those who are not maybe familiar with the convention, say the Convention on on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, which is also normally known with the short name Convention on Migratory Species, or even the acronym CMS, is an intergovernmental treaty which aims at the conservation of migratory species throughout their migratory range. So it is basically is an intergovernmental treaty. The convention focuses on species which cross international jurisdictional boundaries in the course of their migration, and therefore which are subjected to different management regimes throughout their life cycle. And this explains, illustrates well the very reason of existence of the convention, which is to provide a platform for the coordination of policies and measures for the long-term conservation and sustainable use of migratory species. Now, let me go into, I have prepared just a few slides to support the presentation. Let's see if it comes. Is it okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, good. Just a few words on what is the role of CMS on addressing threats to migratory species. CMS uses different approaches in achieving its general aim of conserving migratory species. One of these is the identification of factors which have a significant impact on the conservation status of the species dealt by the convention, and the development of measures and policies to try to mitigate those impacts. So basically, the development of policies and tools is really probably the main role of the convention in threat abatement. However, the convention also aims at providing support to member states for coordinating the implementation of these policies, though normally the responsibilities of that is largely on the member states themselves. And then, last but not least, to raise awareness of governments, which are our primary client, but also other stakeholders, including the general public, on threats to migratory species and options to mitigate them. Light pollution has a significant threat to migratory species, has been, say, recognized under CMS by the 13th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which was held in India in 2020. Of course, the impact of and the effects of light pollution on migratory species have been known for much longer than that, but probably the real the extent of this impact is becoming say known and understood only now, and this is why probably this light pollution has been identified as a standalone issue to address under the convention at the last meeting of the Conference of the Parties. It was actually the initiative of the government of Australia and of the European Union and its member states to separate say submissions that the issue of light pollution was brought to the attention of the Conference of the Parties. The main response was the adoption by the Conference of the Parties of a resolution on light pollution guidelines for wildlife, which inter alia endorsed national light pollution guidelines for wildlife, including marine turtles, seabirds, and migratory shorebirds that have been presented to the Conference of the Parties by the Government of Australia, and that the conference endorsed for use under the convention, urging the member states to use the guidelines, but also recommending their use also by non-parties and other stakeholders. And finally, the resolution is quite articulated. I will put in the chat maybe after the presentation links to the various documents, but the resolution is quite articulated, but it also significantly recommends parties to encourage and support scientific research on the impact of artificial light on wildlife. In addition to the resolution, which is the main policy tools that normally the Conference of the Parties adopts, there was also two decisions which were made, one addressed to the Secretariat with two main elements. One is suggesting to the Secretariat should have suggested to its partners of World Migratory Bird Day to dedicate one of the annual campaigns to light pollution. And this is the very reason why we have this theme, this subject this year. And I would like to also thank all the other partners for accepting the request from our COP to have this subject, and then also requested the Scientific Council of the Convention to consider light pollution in its work. Moving quickly, say as a follow-up to the decision of the COP, the Secretariat has undertaken a review of the impact of light pollution on different taxa of migratory species. A document was presented to the last meeting of the Sessional Committee of the Scientific Council, whom on the basis of that review recommended the development of additional guidelines to mitigate light pollution impacts on land birds and bats. There's been several activities following that. The main one having been the convening of a CMS technical workshop on light pollution that was held in March this year, at which several of the panelists today participated and contributed. And based on the outcome of that workshop, draft guidelines to mitigate light pollution impacts on land birds and bats, and also recommendation to integrate the already endorsed guidelines have been developed. And here I would like to acknowledge the leadership on the scientific and technical side of this initiative of Mark Simmons from the CMS Sessional Committee, and from Letizia Nanni, who supported us as consultant. Just this is basically the step where we are at the moment. We have draft guidelines developed. Next steps foreseen consist in the consolidation of new draft guidelines with the guidelines which have already been endorsed. Then the submission of the consolidated guidelines to the Sessional Committee of the Scientific Council for review and approval. And finally, the submission of the consolidated guidelines to the 14th meeting of the Conference of the Parties for its consideration and endorsement. We expect, therefore, to have a further developed and coherent set of guidelines available by the end of next year. I think I can leave this here. I would just like to acknowledge the support that the Secretariat has received from the governments of Australia and the government of Germany to undertake the various activities that I just referred to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Babari, for the briefing on the CMS guidelines on the light pollution. And our next speaker will bring us a perspective from the national level. As you have heard, the Australian government brought us the decision paper on also the light pollution guidelines for wildlife, and which was adopted during the CMS COP13 in 2020. And today they are with us and brought us, first of all, an animation to promote the issues of the light pollution. And this animation is also now available on the World Migratory Bird Day YouTube channel with 4 languages available. And so let us enjoy this video first, and it will then bring us to Mr. Caesar and McGill to share their work to tackle the light pollution in Australia with us. So thank you.
Artificial light can be harmful to birds, particularly nocturnal seabirds and shorebirds, even from long distances. It can disrupt their sleep, breeding, migration, and cause collisions. It reduces their ability to forage and can make them vulnerable to predators, particularly fledglings. To help Australia's birds, avoid illuminating their feeding and resting areas or migration pathways. Reduce light during breeding and migration seasons. Limit use of artificial light around jetties, wharves, marinas, and at sea. And use low-intensity, appropriate-coloured lights only where and when you really need. Play your part to help our birds by reducing your light pollution. Consult the National Light Pollution Guidelines for Wildlife to find out more about how you can help. Let's switch off light pollution together.
Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed this short animation. It's really well done. And next, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Cesar San McGill, Senior Policy Officer from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water of the Australian government. Mr. San McGill works on the light pollution policy for wildlife, and he has been working on the light pollution since 2020. And most recently, he's working on the further developing the Australian National Light Pollution Guidelines for Wildlife. So over to you, Cesar.
Thank you. And Viola, can you share your screen? So apologies, everyone. I had this lovely dynamic PowerPoint that just couldn't be shared. So I'm going to go through the PDF version. As Vivian said, thank you, Vivian, very much for that. I'm Cesar San Miguel. I work for the Migratory Species section of the Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water. Sorry, it's a mouthful now. And today I'm going to talk about light pollution and how it may impact migratory birds and other wildlife. And also how we're kind of dealing with it in Australia. But before I begin, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the respective lands that attendees are meeting on today. I'm currently speaking from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. I would also like to pay my respect to traditional elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognize their continuing connection to land, sea, and sky. Next slide, please, Vivian. So, yep, we'll try to very quickly cover, and I apologize if some of you have already gone over some of this stuff, but we'll do a recap on what light pollution is, why it's a problem for migratory birds, and the National Light Pollution Guidelines for Wildlife here in Australia. So, next slide. Whoops, one moment. So almost all life on Earth has evolved over millions of years to be adapted to daily cycles of darkness and light over the 24-hour period, as well as lunar cycles, where nights are brighter during the full moon and darker during the new moon. And next slide, please. And seasonal cycles, so from longer nights and shorter days in the winter and longer days and shorter nights during the summer. So over evolutionary timescales, organisms that adapted to these predictable light-dark cycles have been successful. And so this has been really key because we need to understand, the function of light and dark and how it facilitates a healthy environment or healthy ecosystem before we can even begin to think about addressing it at a national level or through policy. So just for, as we think about that, obviously diurnal species like humans require the night for rest, recovery, and refuge, as do a lot of other diurnal or daytime species. Next slide, please. And sorry about that. There's some other graphics in there, so it's not all making sense. I promise there was some other stuff. But anyway, there's also an entire world of wildlife that have evolved to be active at night. So nocturnal species can use the cover of darkness to undertake important activities and avoid being eaten, like bats, as you see there in the corner. Sea turtles, which have been the poster child of impacts of light pollution, haul themselves ashore at night to lay their eggs, and their hatchlings then find their way back to the ocean using natural light cues. And it's actually turtles that brought light pollution to the Australian government's attention in the first instance. We were developing a recovery plan, a conservation document to address the recovery of sea turtles in Australia. And it's through that process that we, discovered that light pollution was a particular problem for them. And as we were trying to address light pollution for sea turtles, we realized, my goodness, light pollution actually impacts a whole range of wildlife, particularly migratory species. Yeah, so that actually brings us back to migratory birds, which, similar to sea turtles, also use the cover of darkness for refuge from predators. But some migratory birds can actually also use visual cues from the moon and stars to find their way to the ocean, and also find their way back to breeding colonies. And then, there are also more cryptic things that happen at night too that we don't quite see, like coral spawning, which is tied to phases of the moon. And some fish eggs don't hatch under lit conditions, but instead hatch when it's dark, and again, probably to avoid predation. Next slide, please. So basically, we know that natural darkness is essential for wildlife and ecosystems. Any man-made changes to light and dark, or the light and dark environment, can interfere with and harm wildlife. So our use of artificial light at night, such as streetlights, cars, boats, homes, commercial buildings, all of this artificial light becomes light pollution when it's unwanted, inappropriate, or excessive, and begins to have those negative impacts on wildlife. Next slide. Oh, sorry about this. This was maybe next slide. Thank you. That was a video that the Australian government, one of the many videos that the Australian government designed to kind of communicate the general issues around light pollution. Can you go back one slide, Vivian? Oh, perfect. And as was mentioned before, light has been really great for humans, but light pollution imposes a serious stress on wildlife and biodiversity, which are already under threat from the pressures of climate change, land clearing, invasive species, other threats. As was mentioned earlier, it's estimated to be increasing by about 2% per year, although this could very likely be an underestimate. In the US and Europe, for example, it's estimated that around 80% of people can no longer see the Milky Way. And as for migratory birds, it can be really challenging to address light pollution when light pollution can actually interfere, be seen, be detected from very far away. And also, it can fall into jurisdictions outside of your direct control. And migratory birds have a long way to travel, and it's a challenge to control light pollution along large migratory pathways, as well as within their habitat. And you can see here my little poor markings there that there's quite a bit of light pollution along most of the East Asian Australasian flyway. Next slide, please. So again, we need to understand how light is impacting these critters before we can, start to figure out how to mitigate those impacts. And light can interfere with wildlife in a few ways, and one way is by interfering with their behavior. Artificial light can attract, confuse, or repel wildlife. So species like migratory birds, they can be misoriented or attracted to the light, and that can add to their migration time or their migration distance, and that can deplete their energy, and that can lead to exhaustion, poor health, injury, and death. And it can also increase, as mentioned, risks of collisions with infrastructure, particularly if birds get trapped by these big light bubbles in urban areas. And wildlife can also be disoriented or confused by light sources. As I mentioned, turtles, in-water lights from jetties and boats are known to cause turtle hatchlings to swim in circles, and that confuses their orientation towards the open ocean. And again, that can lead to exhaustion and predation. And lastly, light can actually repel species from some parts of their habitat. And while that image in the right-hand corner there is of bats, we actually know that shorebirds may avoid suitable feeding grounds if they're lit up. So by preventing access to that habitat, artificial light can basically fragment that habitat or diminish it. And that obviously can lead to access to fewer resources, and that can also mean fewer individuals are interacting, which can mean less genetic diversity if they're breeding with fewer individuals or fewer different individuals, and that can reduce the health of a population or a species, and that could potentially have consequences into the wider ecosystem. Next slide, please. So apologies about this one. There's a few more graphics there too. Another impact on wildlife is called masking. And masking just means that artificial light at night makes it seem as though it's a different time of month, a different time of day, or a different time of year. And masking can actually drive physiological changes and change hormonal triggers. And that itself can lead to behavioral change. So light can mask the 24-hour day-night cycle. Again, we had a really good graphic there. So while these are, there's a reference to some journal articles where we know that while they're not migratory species, we do know that light pollution here in Australia can impact the sleep, disrupt the sleep in magpies, pigeons, and black swans. Light pollution can also delay, roost emergence in bats, and it can actually prevent zooplankton from migrating to the surface of the ocean's water column at night. And that can actually have cascading impacts on other critters that rely on that zooplankton migration. Lastly, artificial light can also mask seasonal changes in day length. I think I heard somebody mention earlier that exposure to artificial light at night can actually cause songbirds to breed earlier in the year, and that can also affect the growth of plants and the timing of flowering. So you're talking about desynchronizing in these ecosystems and these really complex interrelationships, and that can obviously, you'll have that flow-on effect onto other species that rely on those plants or those birds. So again, apologies about the complexity of that graphic. There are a lot of subtle changes between the left and right image. If you want to see them, you can actually go to the Australian government website, which I'll share with you in the chat, and you can get more about, see more of our light pollution comms documents. Next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. And actually, interestingly enough, and this is becoming a bigger issue, is we realize that light pollution can actually benefit invasive species, and invasive species tend to be your bigger threats to a lot of species like migratory birds. We know that cats and foxes may potentially benefit from seeing birds at night because they're visual predators, and getting a little more visibility at night may make it easier for them to find birds. And it can actually enhance other pressures as well. Reptiles like cane toads here in Australia or geckos can benefit from artificial light. They'll sit around poles here in Australia and eat a bunch of insects. And cane toads are a particular problem. They put pressure on a lot of different species, including migratory birds in Australia. It can also benefit other birds invasive birds, which don't belong in certain habitat, as well as invasive plants. So, sorry, all that to say, next slide, please, that there are a variety of pathways that artificial light impacts the environment, and these are really key for us to understand at a national government level or even at a local level. We understand that it can impact behavior, it can impact physiology, and that can lead to ecosystem changes. So it's pretty clear for us that we need to address light pollution in some way, or as well as understand it. So the question then becomes, how do we take care of our migratory birds to keep them functioning well? So in response, next slide, please. To address this conservation challenge, the Australian government actually developed the National Light Pollution Guidelines for Wildlife in 2020. And the purpose of the light pollution guidelines is first and foremost to raise awareness of the impact of light on wildlife, as many people, including some scientists, don't really realize that artificial light at night is a problem for the environment. It's called diurnal bias. So more and more we're seeing people become aware. But in the first instance, at a national level, it's absolutely key that we get people to understand that light pollution is a problem in the first place. A lot of people think of it as a nuisance, but they don't realize it's an issue. Next slide, please. And as mentioned, they also provide these 6 best practice principles, which you can see on the screen, and they're applicable to any lighting changes. You can do it at home, or it can be scaled up to larger projects. And all 6 really should be used together to effectively mitigate the impacts of light pollution. Next slide, please. And the guidelines, most importantly, they actually provide a framework to assess and manage impacts on wildlife. And describe in detail how light should be considered in an environmental impact assessment process and managed through an adaptive management approach. So at the national level, we really are, when we're talking about threatened species, they're considered what's called a matter of national environmental significance. And there's got to be this environmental impact assessment done to see how the light impacts the species and how we can mitigate it. So as you go around that circle on the right there, It requires you in the first instance to describe the lighting and its purpose, then assess the light risk, the risk that light poses to wildlife. Then you need to propose a mitigation method relevant to that wildlife, tailored to that wildlife in that context. And then adapt the lighting as needed. You need to, take a step back. You need to then assess the success of the design that you've put in place, and the mitigation. And then if it isn't quite working, you want to be able to adjust it to make it better so it's tailored to the wildlife. Now, the thing I would note here is that, at least in the Australian context, the only way to know for certain if wildlife are impacted is to monitor their behavior both before the lighting change and after the lighting change. There really isn't a more effective way to know if you're having an impact on wildlife than that. I mean, there are ways to measure physiology, but those can be very complicated and very expensive. So from, again, the national policy point of view, we got to look at behavior. Next slide, please. The guidelines also lay out information and approaches that intend to bring together lighting experts, like your lighting designers and engineers, and your biologists. And these two groups traditionally do not interact, and there's been a little bit of resistance, but there really is a great opportunity for these two groups to come together and create better solutions to light pollution. And at least in Australia, as we've tried to get these two groups in a room, more and more, there has been some resistance at first, but they're cottoning on to addressing, biologists are starting to understand the requirements that engineers need to stick to, and engineers are starting to more and more understand the environmental aspect of their designs. So we're slowly making progress there. Next slide, please. As mentioned as well, there's also taxa-specific advice for more detailed information. It's at the moment we have it for turtles, shorebirds, and seabirds, but more are in development. And the main body of the guideline is still broadly applicable to all susceptible wildlife. So in Australia, we're about to develop another advice for bats and a few other species. So watch this space, or taxa groups. Next slide, please. Is there one? Oh, maybe I didn't put it in the new one. Anyway, so there's a slide in there that I wanted to just mention that the guidelines in Australia are at the moment just guidelines. They're not really regulatory. They don't have regulatory teeth. They can't stop you from putting in a lighting project for the most part, or require you to do lighting in a certain way. They're only really regulatory if they are conditioned by our environmental assessments office. So if you have to refer a giant development to the government, and it has a big lighting impact on turtles or birds, then we can condition some of the what's in the guidelines. But I would note that more and more referrals are coming to us with considering light pollution. We're seeing more light management plans crop up, which is really great. So there's the awareness raising is starting to do its job. Next slide, please. Previous slide. Sorry, I was still on my other slide. So anyway, although this information was first developed in an Australian context, the broad technical and practical information contained in the guidelines can be applied in any country in any context. So as mentioned, we presented those guidelines to CMS, and at the 13th Conference of Parties, they endorsed the guidelines, and they made them available as a CMS document. That means if your country doesn't have a framework, or your jurisdiction doesn't have a framework for managing artificial light around wildlife, you can take these guidelines. They are available for your use. And the CMS, as I mentioned, it's so great. They're in the process of developing the guidelines further to address migratory land birds and bats, and better tailor those guidelines to international use and fill in any gaps or update them with new research. And I'm personally excited to see how that process continues and how that space develops internationally. So good job, CMS. And as mentioned as part of the endorsement, CMS also encouraged government parties to raise awareness, incorporate the effects of light pollution into environmental decision-making, work with peak bodies, create solutions, and encourage the support of research into the impacts on light on wildlife. And we're trying to do all those things at the national level. We're trying to work with our national environmental science program. I'm trying to raise awareness, and we're trying to get more and more of those stakeholders together to find solutions. And there's currently a lot of momentum to address light pollution, both here in Australia and internationally. So again, I'm so grateful that World Migratory Bird Day has chosen to address light pollution as this year's theme. I would also, encourage all of you here today to spread this information about light pollution and how to mitigate its impacts. So next slide, almost done. Beautiful. So in summary, light pollution is increasing and it harms a variety of wildlife in a variety of different ways. And that can have, mitigating the impacts of light on species like birds or migratory birds can really have flow-on effects to other species. So it's important for whole ecosystems. It's tricky. It's a challenge. Migratory birds occupy a large amount of space or inhabit a lot of space on the planet across several jurisdictions. But it doesn't mean it can't be overcome. We have these national light pollution guidelines for wildlife, pardon me, and they're there to help you manage light pollution no matter where you are. Next slide. And I would also mention that the Australian government, you can get more information there from our website. I've put it in the chat. CMS has some information, and World Migratory Bird Day will have some links as well. So all of that is really great information. By popular demand, we've developed these 1- and 2-pager documents that are they're more contracted versions of the guidelines. Admittedly, the guidelines are about 100 pages, and people have been wanting us to give them a 1- or 2-page, just shortened version of what's in the guidelines. So those will be coming soon. If you want them now, give me a shout and I'll send them to you. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions in the chat or if you put them in the Q&A while we're listening to the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Sengmagu. Now, moving to the other side of the world, our last speaker today is Mr. Ivo Tejeda, Executive Director of the Network of Birdwatchers of Chile. Mr. Tejeda works together with the researchers and the community to improve the best lighting practices of urban areas near to seabirds. So it is now a city levels sharing with us. So Mr. Tejeda, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Vivian. Just confirm me if the presentation looked well.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you everybody. It's really nice to be here. I would like to present this guide to seabird-friendly lighting in Chile. It's some of the initiatives that we took to address a really big problem with seabirds and light pollution in Chile. This is a joint effort with 3 organizations, Oikonos, ROC, and OPCC. The last one works mainly with the astronomy sector. We have a lot of observatories in northern Chile, and light pollution regulations have been made in Chile for the observatories. And this has the sponsor of the Ministry of the Environment and the support of American Bird Conservancy and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So globally, seabirds are severely affected by light pollution. We know that like more than 50 species are affected by light pollution worldwide, but this is a phenomenon that also occurs in Chile. At least 15 species that breed in Chile throughout the country. We are a country with more than 4,000 kilometers of coast. Are impacted with light pollution, mostly fledglings like the storm petrel at the right. And it's a problem that affects like thousands really like thousands of individuals each year. Light pollution regulations are relevant advances. We have since several years ago a light pollution regulation, but it's restricted only to the areas for the observatories to do astronomy. And since last year, there is a process to update the light pollution regulations so they can be for the whole country and also include some biodiversity and health issues. But right now we only have the light pollution regulation for astronomy. So we thought that a practical approach oriented to project development that is complementary with the light pollution regulation was a necessary step to address this problem. So this is the guide that I would like to present briefly today. The guide is aimed to mainly developers of projects, so the people who want to design a project that includes light pollution, but it can be from both public and private, mainly ports, mines, street lighting, everything. But also project evaluators or government officials that are involved in the environmental assessment processes. And also professionals of public services involved in territorial planning at different scales. This is like how the guidelines look like. I think we were kind of inspired by the Australian guidelines that were presented before, but we thought that it was necessary to do something especially for Chile. You know? So the first chapter refers to about light pollution, what is their definition, characteristics, the main impacts, not only in astronomy, that was like the main discourse in Chile, but also biodiversity and health, some examples of international mitigation efforts, and the situation in Chile that also like the else of the world is getting a bigger and bigger problem each year. This is a picture of the city of Iquique, northern Chile, at night. The second chapter is a description of the problem with seabirds in Chile. Yeah? As I said, this is really a huge problem that affects several thousands of seabirds each year, and we describe the main species affected in Chile. Making a review of the state of the art right now. Here at the picture, you can see like several Markham storm petrel affected by the pollution in northern Chile. And here are some pictures of what it looks like, the problem with light pollution and seabirds in Chile. It affects more than 15 species, as I said, like diving petrels, storm petrels, also shearwaters. So, and at the middle you can see like some Markham storm petrel being rescued, so they can liberate it later. The guide presents this infography referring to the most affected species. And also it was really important to identify the main areas where this occur. So as you see on the map, on northern Chile, there are several breeding colonies of storm petrels that some of them are in the middle of the desert and were discovered like quite recently. It's like a work in progress, and each year we know better where these storm petrels are breeding. There are also some points at the some islands at the center of Chile, and also some islands like more far away, like Robinson Crusoe, Santa Clara, and Alejandro Serkrik, there from Juan Fernandez archipelago. And there also we have problems with light pollution, like in the Andes, in the mountains at central Chile, where some storm petrels also breed, but the colonies aren't discovered yet. And it was important, like in a parallel work, to maintain like a special database of where the colonies are. So we have like a lot of problems with projects that are developed in the northern Chile, in the desert, mainly for energy, like solar and eolic power, and some mines. So they really don't know yet where, if there are some colonies, breeding sites of storm petrels near where they are going to place. The next chapter shows the regulatory context in Chile. We have some light pollution regulation, as I said, but there are some other regulations that affect light pollution, like the base environmental law, some municipal ordinances in some municipalities. There are also some public lighting regulations and the species conservation plans for some endangered species. This is mainly for the pink-footed shearwater and the storm petrels that breed in the northern Chile. And that status that they have a conservation plan is really important for how the light pollution regulations are interpreted. So next, we show some principles for good lighting. These are like quite similar of the ones developed by the International Dark Sky Association. Lights should be useful, targeted with low light, avoiding blue wavelengths and controlled. But then we do some recommendations, trying to put the point that natural darkness is the starting point for each project that may affect the breeding sites of seabirds in Chile. So these are some of the examples of the recommendations that are described in the guide that take place or apply the principles in the chapter before. Directing light, the design of the installations, to avoid excessive illumination levels, to apply dimmers, time restrictions, adaptive lighting, and minimizing the use of cold lights. And next, that this something is very important for us, and it's similar of what was in the Australian guidelines, is to propose 6 steps, iterative steps, for environmental assessment of projects that may affect seabirds with light pollution. I think that right now these steps are just some of them are being really developed by projects that do have to pass with environmental assessment, but more projects may use these steps in the future. So the first is to characterize potential seabirds that are impacted for light pollutions. Then describe the illumination objectives, describe the potential impacts that may occur with seabirds, and for the design of a lighting plan. This is something like, it may sound like really a basic step, but most of the projects that affect light pollution, affect seabirds with light pollutions, they don't have really a lighting plan. No, they are just like lights and more lights, and we have this problem that the projects at the desert of Chile, they have like a lot of sunlight in the day, so with the sun energy is like really cheap over there, so they are putting more and more lights. So we hope that in the future more projects can design a lighting plan, then assess and quantify the expected impacts, and at last to monitor and to evaluate if the plan that was designed is really working in terms of the impacts for seabirds. So these are the steps that I described before that are in the guide. And lastly, we propose that land use planning, that in the case of sensitive natural areas that are to be protected from light pollution, we propose the recommendation to generate a lighting master plan. This is something like quite new for the country, that we hope that in some areas, in some islands, for example, and in some important areas in the north of Chile, near the breeding grounds, they may have this kind of planning in the future. The guide also have some case studies of how light pollution has been treated in some different places. Some of them are maybe more successful, like the one in Robinson Crusoe Island, where, for example, Oikonos, one of the organizations that work with this project, managed to change some of the lights that were affecting the pink-footed shearwater. But some other places like Punta Choros and Salar Grande, the case studies just show how the lights that haven't been planified and haven't been changed affect hundreds or thousands of individuals of diving petrels or storm petrels in each place. So what's next? We're planning several workshops to disseminate the guide to some public and private stakeholders. This in the context of the implementation of some conservation plans for principally for storm petrels in the northern Chile. And we see right now that some projects, mining projects and solar projects in northern Chile are currently starting to mention this guide as a new standard for the lighting practice. This guide was presented some months ago, so we don't know how are going to be the results, but we're expecting that they will take some of the ideas, standards, and steps that are proposed in the guide. But anyway, there's like a long way to go to address the problem of light pollution on seabirds in Chile, and we have to address it from different perspectives, and this is just one of them. Okay, so that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tejeda, and all the speakers for your presentation. For our audience, you can also leave your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom. And now it is the Q&A section, and I would like to pass on to Mr. Florian Cao from the CMS to moderate the sections. So Florian, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vivian, and a big thank you to all the speakers and participants of this second global webinar on the topic of light pollution, marking World Migratory Bird Day. Thank you very much. It's been informative. And I'd like to just hand over to the audience. I see there was one question already posed. We have a question from David Smith. It's been answered already, but I think it might be valuable for others as well, so I'll just read it out. So the question to Cesar is, how successful have the national light pollution guidelines for wildlife been? Do you have any case studies showing the benefits? And how do you ensure guidelines are followed? Is there a need for legislation? Maybe we can just talk about that briefly. And I'm opening up. Anyone has questions, please add them in the chat. Thank you.
So I guess I'll go ahead and give you an audio answer. So yes, the guidelines have only been published for about 2 years. So timeline on taking the guidelines and implementing them and seeing action on the ground can actually be quite long, because when you're looking at impacts on species, you often have to monitor over multiple seasons depending on the species. It could be a breeding season or a migratory season. So we're still in the process of collecting that. I'm actively looking for somebody who's taken the guidelines and implemented them to see if there's been benefits, if they've been useful in a very practical implementation sense. But as I said, one of the purposes of the guidelines is awareness raising, and in that way they've been very successful, because they've spurred on people to write to the government, to write to the minister. It spurred us to develop the animations to really explain the issue better. It's helped us identify that we need to develop some shorter guidance documents, some 1- and 2-page documents. So in that way, they have been successful. They've been getting conversation going. They've started to trickle into media and social media, and it's actually helped councils, local governments, say, look, there are these guidelines from the national government. how do we implement these in a local scale? How do we make lighting ordinances a little stricter or a little smarter, a little better? And so there has been more and more councils, been more momentum being driven in part by the National Light Pollution Guidelines. If we hadn't have done that, a lot of those conversations probably wouldn't have happened. People may have grumbled about light, but they wouldn't have had guidance or a framework for helping them think about light pollution in their context.
Thank you, Cesar. I don't see any other questions, but in the absence of questions, I'd like to throw one in. Yesterday in the webinar, we had an interesting comment coming from the audience about the impact of cruise ships off the coast and potentially being a source of collision attraction for many migratory birds that are flying over the water. And I'd just like to throw into the room to both Cesar and Ivo, if you have any information or any incidences that you can talk about, talking about vessels and the impact of shipping off the coast of Chile or in the Australian context.
Yeah, I can answer that. In Chile, we have like anecdotal evidence that the impact occurs. We know from cases like in vessels near the ports in northern Chile, where sometimes like dozens of storm petrels have been found, and also at the south of Chile, where there are a lot of breeding colonies of some other seabirds, and normally the landscape is more obscure, so there aren't so many cities, like big cities with lights. So it's something that we know that it happens. It hasn't been quantified, and at least, for example, in the conservation plan for storm petrels in northern Chile, it has been identified to something that we should focus in the future, and like a first step is to quantify it, to describe the problem, so how it is right now. But we don't have like a real knowledge of when, where, in which lights, and it's something like more difficult to address. There are, for example, we have some evidence of a vessel, I think, I don't remember from which country was, but there are different countries involved with the flags of these vessels. So, and there are some regulations specific for the ships. That's the situation right now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? I'd have another one in the absence of any questions from the audience. Generally, focusing on cities. In the Australian context, is there a focus on cities and the impact of cities and the light pollution emitted by cities? As we have heard, generally, the topic is still very much emerging, and from what we heard yesterday and the research is all still very new. But what we are seeing at least from the research that Jeffrey Buhler presented yesterday, is that theoretically one could trace shifts in migration along lines of major cities. And the question for me is, what kind of, what does that mean? What does that mean for us in terms of how we target the communication in the future, in terms of where are the main problems when it comes to light pollution on a flyway scale? Really thinking beyond the national context, but on a flyway level. If anyone of the speakers have anything to say, or maybe others in the panel group.
I can start off, but I'm sure that a couple of the other panelists might have some more insight. So in Australia, we're just starting to kind of look at those mass migrations in the way that the United States has, because I know in one of their migratory pathways, they're looking at Doppler radar to see migratory birds and how the impacts of light may be influenced or maybe influencing their migrations. In Australia, I think they're just starting to kick something off the ground there. But we're also really unique in Australia because we have quite a bit of darkness. And migratory birds kind of go all along the coastline in Australia, but humans are also all along the coastline. That's where about, I think, 85% of our population is. And unfortunately, or fortunately, we're transitioning towards LEDs, and I think that's becoming a bigger problem. So cities are going from incandescent lights, which tend to have more orange and yellow in the spectrum and don't necessarily travel as far from the city, to LEDs, which have a lot of blue light in them. And that blue light tends to get spread a little bit further. So I think focusing on smarter lighting systems is probably a good way to start. How do we, in our transition to LEDs, which use much less electricity, and help us with energy efficiency, how do we do those in a smarter way, and also manipulate the wavelengths in them to make them appropriate for wildlife, and also not emit as much light, for as long for certain durations of the night, or shield them better. I think it's going to be about smart lighting systems moving forward if you want to control the urban area, or the sky glow from urban areas, because it is tricky. Once that light's there, it's very expensive to change, and that's been a real challenge too.
Okay, yeah, just as a reminder, I see no further questions, and I think me asking two is enough. I just wanted to point out World Migratory Bird Day is taking place tomorrow. It's the second peak day of the campaign. As you heard in this webinar, light pollution was a focus because it was requested also from 133 countries that are party to the Convention on Migratory Species. What we're seeing clearly, we're just a drop on the stone at the moment, and this topic is an emerging topic. And World Migratory Bird Day this year, I think in many ways has started a ball rolling, or has contributed to something that started in Australia and is working in many other places. In the US, you have a lot of work being done, but internationally, I think it's still a very much emerging topic. And we hope that through World Migratory Bird Day, we manage to get a little bit of attention, and especially through these webinars that we've been doing, which have been really full of rich content, and great presentations that we will be making available for a wider audience through YouTube after this session. So just to wrap up, I also want to again thank all the speakers. Thank you very much for taking the time. I know, Ivo, it's past 3 a.m. in Chile, and it's been an incredible show, especially also with the team, the World Migratory Bird Day partner team with Vivian and Susan and everyone tuning in and helping to make this webinar a success. So thank you, everyone, and happy World Migratory Bird Day tomorrow, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.